All right, good. So thanks everybody for showing up. My name is Keith Perrin. I'm the CEO at Court Square. This is the first of hopefully a number of different sessions we'll potentially do for you guys. Um, our goal is just to educate. I didn't want to do any kind of sales pitch or anything like that. This is really just to let you know about how to organize data or files for the FDA, and we do this a lot. We've been in the industry for a very long time, 30 plus years. And our goal is to continue to work with young companies, particularly ones out of incubators, and help them get to the next level, and just show them some of the things that we've learned over time. So, with that being said, I thank UF Innovate for allowing us to be able to present with you. And Ian is there in the audience, and he brought lunch. So hopefully everybody there is eating some lunch. And the agenda for this one is just talking about some of the FDA standards, what they look for. Um, Content and structure, metadata, reference models, compliance, and then any next steps, open dialogue that you guys have or things that you'd want to see in the future. So, with that being said, let me give you a quick overview of who we are and why we actually know this stuff. So, Court Square Group is a leading provider of what we call ARC. It's an audit-ready, compliant cloud platform for life science. So, it's a hosting environment where we can host any qualified or validated applications for companies. Many of you in potentially in an incubator or a preclinical maybe don't have to worry about dealing with qualified or validated environments yet. Your data is all over the place, but the reality is, over time, as you grow as a company, you're going to need to have more structure put into what you do. So our goal is to work early with companies and to teach them here's the best way to kind of put things together and um, be regulatory compliant right out of the gate, so that as you grow as a company and you add people within the company, it's easier to stay compliant over time. We work with all sorts of life science companies, all the way from um, large molecule, small molecule, biotechs, cell and gene therapy companies, pharma companies, medical device companies. It doesn't really matter. Consultants in this industry. We work with a lot of CROs. We work with a lot of sponsors. So it doesn't matter to us who some of the groups are that we work with. Most of the ones that we work with need some form of regulatory compliance. So the aspect of what we bring to the table is really all around that regulatory compliance. Life science companies must follow FDA guidelines to ensure safety, efficacy, and quality of their products. That's kind of a given. That's the kind of the starting point for what you need to do, particularly when you're dealing with the FDA. Most of the slides that I got from this, we as a company did a life science series last year, a DCL learning series over the course of the last year and a half with two other companies. One was DCL, Data Conversion Laboratories, and the other was Jana Life Sciences. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about those and let you know that here's the actual, there were 7 different modules that we did, and we did these every 3 to 4 weeks over the course of the year. And they're actually hanging off of our website. And if you need to, we can actually give you links into each of those. But if you go to the resource section on our website, they're found there. It's a nice area. And these are hour long, and they go into a lot more detail about what different aspects of some of the things I'm going to talk about today are. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up. I actually have another slide at the very end just to go over that again to let you know where things came from. The FDA, one interesting part about the FDA is they're never really prescriptive. They tell you what they kind of want you to do, but they won't tell you how to do it. So um, there isn't a specific FDA standard dedicated to safe and secure documents for life science companies. It just doesn't exist. There's a couple of rules that they have, and different CFR 21 CFR Part 11 is the spec that they use for most companies to follow. But again, they don't really tell you exactly how it is. The FDA does have regulations and guidelines that life science companies must follow to ensure safety, efficacy, and quality of their products. Um, when I deal with a lot of companies, particularly in the IT space, and they talk about um, life science, they typically are thinking about healthcare and HIPAA and talking about patient um, PHI or PII, the information around individuals. In our space for life science, we really worry more about the patient. We do worry about HIPAA-related issues, but we worry more about the patient safety data because typically most of the data that we're collecting or the documents that we're collecting are going to be used at some point in time for a drug submission. And the goal is to make sure that none of that data is altered along the way and that there's usually big ticket items that go along with those submissions. So the goal there is to make sure that the safety and the efficacy of the drugs are upheld during the manufacturing process, and making sure none of the data that helps a drug get approved is changed at all during the course of that submission process. You're going to hear a number of acronyms along the way, and I'm going to try to explain a few of those acronyms. GXP is kind of an overall way of talking about some of the different good practices. In life science, always you have to follow good documentation practices. So if you haven't been doing that yet, it's something you should do. If you have a quality manual, you probably do have a policy or something that ties back to good documentation practices. And it's just a set of guidelines for make sure you're maintaining your documents the right way, you're archiving things right, you're being able to put things together that people within your company can read them and follow them and use them as you go forward. Good laboratory practice, in typically something that you're going to have in an incubator, is all around dealing with the labs and how you're going to follow the adherence to different things around the processes that you do within a lab, the PM that you're going to do on the equipment, all the different things you would typically do around monitoring and planning and things like that in the lab space. And then GCP is good clinical practice. That's where when you start going out into the clinic and people are monitoring patients and doing stuff with patients and the conduct of the clinical trials you're going to do, GCP. Another acronym you're here is GMP. If a lot of you are in the manufacturing and are doing any manufacturing at all with your products, you're going to talk about GMP, good manufacturing practice. It's funny because from a quality perspective, many of you probably don't even have quality people yet on staff. And if you do, they're coming at it from a totally different angle than the GMP. GMP quality people are very strict around the whole process, particularly around that manufacturing process and making sure that all of the batch records and all the individual items that are typically generated as part of that process are maintained, and that the efficacy and the safety of the drugs and the data integrity of the actual data collected is upheld during the whole time that they're doing that. I want to also mention that while I'm talking, if there's any questions, just raise your hand. If you let Ian know, and he can interrupt me, or just interrupt me, and I can stop. 21 CFR Part 11 is the regs that we typically go by. These are they pertain to the use of electronic records and electronic signatures. It outlines the criteria for how you deal with those electronic records and what you're going to do to use along with paper records. Now, I've actually been on a DIA. DIA is a Drug Information Association, and there's a number of committees within some of these industry groups, and DIA is one of those industry groups. And I was on a destruction of paper committee, and basically we put together a whole framework around the way to get rid of paper in organizations and how you had to have qualified and validated systems to basically maintain the core copies of any of the documents that you're going to use for your company. So there is a way to get rid of paper, and you can follow that. You just got to show that you've documented and you follow the process when you're doing that. Now, data integrity guidance for the industry, it's not a regulations, but the FDA has provided guidance on ensuring data integrity. And this is all around how you're backing up your data, how you're securing data, what kind of data governance you're going to have around that data. And it's important for life science companies to establish and follow your own SOPs for document management, data integrity, and compliance. And if you don't have those, you really should put some of those things in place. One of the issues that we really find with the FDA is they're not going to tell you how to do it. What they want is for you to tell them how you're going to do it, and then document it, and then show that you're actually following what you said you were going to do. So the important part is just to say what you're going to do and then do what you say. If you only remember those things, that's a huge benefit to you going forward. Say what you're going to do and then do what you say. So that's the important part as you go forward. As we get into this, I'm going to start talking about a couple different key topics, particularly around data and documents. And part of it is the first one we're going to go into is content structure. When I talk about content structure, what do we really mean? We're talking about structured versus unstructured data. And just looking at this visualization, you can see just a pile of screws and nuts and washers and all sorts of stuff. And you see how it's unstructured. And you see it's kind of nicely organized and put into little drawers, and that's structured data. Well, if you think about content, the same thing can happen in documents. If I have a form that's a government form that has certain boxes where you fill in, that's called structured data, and that's easy for us to use that data when we go into our systems and we're pulling data off. However, if I'm getting a document like a CV that somebody has written their CV, or it's a report on something, that's typically unstructured data because it's done in just regular plain language text. So when we look at those things, there could be you could actually have a form that has both structured and unstructured data on it, because you could have individual items where you have to put in strict data elements, but then you may have a whole block of text area that becomes unstructured. It's important to know how to deal with that data in the long run for the different systems that are going to use that data. Content structure. When we want to defining a content structure, we want to look at your data. Is it consistent? Is it but unstructured? What data does need to be structured? You know, I'm not getting into this in this discussion. We're not going to talk about data dictionaries and all the things that you would typically do when you're putting in a full-blown, you know, data management plan within a company. You're at a point where it may be applicable to what you need to do. These are just the guidelines that we're going to talk about, just to have you think about what you need to put in place. What was the purpose of the data in its original form? How's the purpose changed? What content do you have, and compare it where you need to be. So basically, if you have it on paper, do I need to make sure that I have an electronic version of that? Do I have it in just records coming off of a laboratory piece of laboratory equipment? Do we need to store that somewhere else? So that should be stored in the database. All those kind of things around content. It could be documents, but it also could be data sets. It could be data coming directly from patients or from animals within a lab. It doesn't matter. All of that is content, and it's how you want to structure that content and use that content as you go forward. Some of the terminology that you're going to hear are things like ontologies and taxonomies. The concept of taxonomies and ontologies is just how are you setting up the data, and then how is all that data interconnected? How do they tie together across different taxonomies? So the important part is just to figure out when you need to use that and how you're going to use that. I've got a couple slides later on, once we get into the metadata era, that'll illustrate some areas about how it makes a real big difference the way you set that up. Once we get into looking at data, part of what we need to do is figure out what is metadata. You may have heard the term, but don't know what it means. The FDA even said metadata is the contextual information required to understand data. A data value is by itself meaningless without additional information about the data. So it's basically something that's going to describe that data and tell you where that data came from or what it's going to be used for. In this example, we're looking at just the number 42. What is it? Is it a measurement? Is it a temperature? Is it Fahrenheit or Celsius? What does it really mean? You know, without context, it's just a number. So you've got to somehow put that context on that number. And the way we do that, typically within the systems that we're going to use, is called metadata. You've seen it in the past, and maybe some of you are young enough where you don't see this because they don't really use these anymore. But a library card catalog, when you go in and look where the book is going to be within a library, some of the metadata will be the title, the author, the publishing name, the publishing date, or an abstract about the book itself. So those are things that in the past would have been what you use to find data. Now, with our systems today, we need metadata as a certain way of being able to find some of that data. There are systems out there doing AI-based systems that are using advanced indexing techniques and things like that. They'll use some of that metadata, but they'll also use some of the content within documents and almost do a metadata definition on the way in, and we're actually using some of those tools right now for some of the projects that we're working on. So what is metadata? In the pharma world, metadata can also be applied to completed, compiled sets of data, test reports, package inserts. The information, it could be where the country that it's applicable for. It could be a revision of the product ingredients. It could be DINS numbers. It could be manufacturers' names. You may have multiple distributors within different countries, or if you're going into the EU, you may have a distributor for each country out there. So all those kind of things can go into what metadata is. And metadata doesn't have to be a all or nothing type of thing. You may have certain metadata on some aspects of your data, and then other metadata for other aspects. So I'll show a couple slides on that later on and kind of explain that concept. So to establish a metadata strategy, you first need to know what your data is all about. What data do you have, and what documents do you have? How would we want to search for it, or how do we want to use it between one system to another? Always think about the way you're going to use it and then work backwards from that. And the types of metadata and the usage of that metadata is driven by different things like workflows. If I'm going to do a workflow, am I going to use different things like parameters that say level of completeness on that? If it's going to be a review workflow, is there somebody that's in a path that it has to be done serially, or can it be done asynchronously? So it all depends on how you want to deal with the data itself or the workflows. The assets themselves, compliance and security, you may have metadata on it to tell it which group can actually look at that data. Or if it's part of a larger data set, maybe some people can look at pieces of that data. And then when you go to publish, you want to be able to use metadata to publish it, to say, hey, this is part of a drug submission that's going in, or this is part of a CMC library that's going to be used for this particular submission. Again, metadata is all developed around the strategy that you're going to use it. And even when you're first starting out and you're first starting looking at your lab notebooks, even laying out your lab notebooks and putting things in there, you want to think about the metadata that you're going to define for those particular products. When I think about metadata and taxonomy together, you want to look at, how do we kind of tie these things together? And you look at ICD-11 codes, you look at metadata within the documents themselves. There are tremendous business benefits around the content classification, and just the way you want to search through documents, improve finding of documents. I know that we did a project once with one of our customers, and they had done a study of their own work, and they found that I think it was 40% of their employees' day was spent looking for documents. Now that's a real problem when you think about how much money you spend on the employees in a company, and the more documents you get, the tougher it is to find things. So not having a good taxonomy, not having the good metadata that ties into that taxonomy means that it's going to be much harder to find what you need, particularly as you grow as a company and you work with multiple products and multiple partners even. That's another aspect you have to think about. One of the things that we look at from a key aspect of drug development, think about all the systems that are involved in the different areas. So if I look at this particular diagram, we're talking about the same product could actually have multiple different product names along the way, depending on where you're looking at it. It may just have a code early on, but then it gets a name, an insider name, and then it gets a name that's going to be used out in the wild. And then you've got the lot numbers that are associated with that, batch numbers associated with that, production. And then some of the systems underneath it are going to be using some of those metadata. So those are the other things you have to think about. Early on, we have LIMS, laboratory information management systems, that are generating some of that data or using some of that data to put that along the cycle. And then when you get into clinical, you're typically going to be doing things with the trial master file. A clinical trial is typically always documented per what is now a CDISC standard, which is the eTMF spec. Started out as a DIA reference model, but now is actually a CDISC specification. Many people in data management are using SAS or Spotfire or R or all sorts of other tools to get into that data and look at the data and put that data around. Regulatory is where you really start getting into then taking all the information from the different groups and putting it together within a submission package that's going to be submitted to the FDA. Once you're approved and you're actually into full manufacturing, then you also have an ERP system that's actually going to be looking at the orders that are coming in, the manufacturing aspect of it, the MRP, and being able to track all of your drugs on while they get manufactured and then sent out to the actual distributors. And one of the big things about this is you want to have quality throughout the process. So using quality and thinking about quality from day one is a big part of how it can be useful along the way for building up your company. Some people will look at early on just in having a departmental focus. You'll look at functions. You'll set up whatever storage it is. Some of you use Box or Dropbox or Ignite or different things like that. We have a system called RegDoc 365 that has a pre-configured department folder structure. So our goal is to actually give you something to start with. Most people will start with whatever they had at the last company they worked at. That's all right, but if you get 10 people from 10 different companies, all of a sudden everybody's fighting as to where the data is going to be, and they always think that their place is better. So if you as a company start out with something right out of the gate, it makes your life a lot easier going forward. Oops. Went the wrong way. A lot of times we can take metadata and actually use it as an additive kind of way when we look at where the data was actually created from an individual contributor. Is it part of a project? Is it part of an overall program? And then does it belong to a certain department? Am I now in toxicology versus I'm in clinical or regulatory? So those are the areas you want to kind of think about and use that metadata as a way of seeing where documents or data is along the continuum of your drug development process. A LIMS system actually pulls in data from all sorts of other places. You may have inventory management systems you're tying stuff through. You may have quotations and invoicing for different things when you're setting something up. You may have an eLab notebook that you're tied into. You might have stability studies that you're working on, sample management system. All these things are typically tied together through a LIMS system. And all that data has to be found correctly and categorized correctly. So understanding how best to define your metadata for that is really important. Same thing when you start getting into even larger volumes of data. Some of you may be involved with this now, some of you may not. The concept of high throughput screening is trying to figure out how to fail fast. What we want to do is use computers to figure out what works and what doesn't work and throw the stuff out that doesn't work right away so that we can concentrate on the stuff that does work. Major area within life science. Let's move on to from the metadata. Let's go from go up a level. Instead of using or looking at the metadata at that low level of the individual elements, let's look at how is it used within reference models and what are a reference model and why would we have those in this industry? Well, in this industry, there's a number of different areas. A couple that we deal with heavily are the EDM reference model, which is used for doing submission processing work. And for those of you that have never submitted anything to the FDA, basically there's a way to do it through a electronic gateway that gets your data out to that submission gateway, the ESG, and that will get it into the FDA. And you typically have to have it in a format called ECTD. ECTD is Electronic Common Technical Document, and it's a mandate that the FDA made so that we can cut down on the amount of time it takes to process a drug submission. It was taking forever for the FDA reviewers to go through all the documents when they didn't have the spec. So by putting in the spec, it now allows you to have all these documents linked together in a certain way, looking at it from different views of the data within the modules and being able to really understand how to classify that data. And it saved them a large amount of time. I think it was something like, years down to months worth of review from the original when they put the spec in place. Here's an example in the clinical space. We have the electronic trial master file, which is eTMF. We're very familiar with this because we use it all the time, particularly in clinical trials. The top level of a metadata is the zone. So when we look at the different zones that are there, there's 11 different zones. And if you think about it from a file structure or a folder structure, it could be folders within folders within folders. And if you look at this, you're going to look at from the left-hand side moving to the right. On the left-hand side, we're just talking about content classification. How do we categorize it? Is it for site management? Is it site documentation versus site selection? Is it content types? Is it protocol signature page? Is it a 1572 or is it a confidentiality agreement? All those are then PDF. The FDA wants everything in PDF format, so it doesn't have to worry about having the applications to actually open any of these. And then you've got properties tied to that once it goes into a PDF that have the names on it, has the organization, what type of document it's going to be, who the credentials are, the study IDs, all the different things that they're going to want to look at. And then all of that will get put into that TMF reference model. When you're looking at it in different systems, this happens to be a screenshot from one of our systems with the TMF. You basically are looking at across the top, you've got all the different metadata elements, and these are TMF zone, TMF section, TMF component, TMF source. And then you tell which level. Is it site level or is it the whole study level? Then you're looking at the individual documents themselves, and you can see that they're CVs, and they're labeled as such. Typically, people use all of that metadata they'll put into the title of the document. That's how most people will do things if they don't have a system that actually has metadata. And then you'll look that you've got CVs, you've got 1572s, and you've got financial disclosure forms, all held within the same place, but differentiated based on the metadata that they're used. And you can set up different views into your data, which is important when you're trying to find your data. Let's go on to the next. After you get all that data back from the clinical trials and you've taken it all back and your data management group has gone through it all and has created all the tables that are going to be used, all the information that's going to be put in, you've got your CMC reports, everything's turned over to the medical writers, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's got to be put into something that's going to go to the FDA. So it really starts out from the left-hand side here where the data pulled from a lot of different systems. It's then prepared and validated, and it's migrated and validated eTMF. It's then formatted for the submissions, and then it's sent through a validator. And this validation is different than validated systems that we typically think of from an IT perspective. The ECDD validator will actually go through and look at every link and verify that there's no dangling links and that there's documents there for each of the links, so that when it gets to the FDA gateway, they know that it's going to pass through that, because that's what it's going to do, that same validation step as part of the gateway. That's why it's so important to understand where your data is and to label it correctly and use that from the very start to the very end. Some of the different reference models that you'll see along the continuum, a lot of it starts out with EISF. EISF is investigator site files used at the clinical sites. The TMF is the trial master file, and there's a subset of data that comes directly off of the EISF that gets put into the TMF. And then the same thing can be said. Most of Module 5, I believe it's Module 5 for the EDM reference model comes from the TMF, and then the rest of it is from different areas. So the EDM reference model is used with the different modules, and the ECDD common technical document structure is set up to be able to do the submission to the FDA. Then once you've done a submission to the FDA, you usually have a RIM system. RIM stands for Regulatory Information Management, and that's where you can tie it back to which countries you're working with, which regulators you're dealing with. Lately, I've been on a couple committees talking specifically about how can we use AI to look at how the regulators are looking at our submissions and what they like and what they don't like. The questions that they ask us, can we put off those questions by doing a better job at putting the right information into the submission so that it precludes them from asking those questions. So they've already got the information. So it's things like that we use these data elements and these reference models to help put together systems that make the most sense for our client base. Let's look a little bit at compliance. And when we talk about compliance, we're talking a little bit about data governance. You may or may not be even talking about data governance at this point, but a big part of that is security. Everybody does worry about security. Everybody worries about, can somebody get to my data? And typically you're worried about it more from a perspective of, that's my ID, it's my intellectual property. I don't want somebody else to get my intellectual property. Well, as you get more data and you're starting to do more things, you're going to have financial data, you're going to have personal data, you're going to have a lot of things. So you want to be able to secure that both internally and externally, because you still want to have external people getting into your data, but it's how they get into it and how they use it so that you don't leave it wide open for somebody else. The granularity of that security, how deep they can go in within a folder structure, and is the security inherited across the board. And then we look at the governance model with either zero trust, or we're looking at how do we set up the governance model, which is really around how do we let people access our data and what they do. And then there's the concept of open and closed systems. And if you have a closed system if it's all held in-house and you're doing everything. It's open if you've got somebody else processing things and they're brought together. However, you can make an open system closed by qualifying your vendors and qualifying the processes around what you're doing with those vendors and how they're tying those things together. You have to understand how that all works in order to be able to put that together. We deal a lot with a couple different key areas, and one of those areas is called the qualification, the qualified environments. In order to have a qualified environment, you have to make sure that all of your people are trained correctly to be able to manage that environment. You have to make sure that the environment that it's in is qualified from a perspective of you're looking at how it was installed and that you follow the instructions. You've got artifacts that show that you've got that. So those are important pieces there. If you're working with cloud vendors, do they maintain compliance or do you have to maintain compliance for them? We have our audit ready compliant cloud. We maintain that compliance for our customers so they don't have to worry about it. It's one way to cut down on what you need from a quality perspective. And can we qualify a public cloud vendor or application? Absolutely. It just depends on the amount of work you want to put into doing that qualification aspect. Once you've qualified an application or an environment, you can then put out validated applications on it. You may or may not have heard the terms IQ, OQ, PQ, installation qualification, operational qualification, performance qualification, or production qualification. People have referred to it both ways. And it's really around how do I install it and make sure that it's installed correctly? How do I then operate it and make sure that it's running? And typically we're going to have what's called a UAT, user acceptance testing. And then the same thing happens with the PQs, with the performance testing, where the users are going to run through and they're going to verify that it works the way they say it was going to work. So IQs, OQs, PQs, common terminology in this world. We want to be able to maintain that validation across those systems. So starting with a qualified environment, then maintaining the validation by making sure that you follow proper change control, which is really important in this environment. Many IT environments will follow change control, but unless you have the artifacts that are there so that when an auditor comes in and looks at that, he wants to be able to see that. When the vendors update things, what do you do and what are your actions? And then you looked at forced updates. Sometimes you're working in environments and you don't have time to test things because they've just forced things down on you. Those are really tough environments sometimes to work on. So you really have to understand, is it forced or planned? And how do I deal with it either way? From those perspectives, we work with a lot of different validated applications. You may or may not in this point, but I will tell you that as you grow or as you start to work with other partner companies out there, they're going to want to make sure that the data that you're working with and the data that they're going to rely on from a partnering perspective has been secured and is in an area that makes the most sense for them as a company. I'm sure every one of you want to have the opportunity where somebody will buy your company at some point. And if that's the case, you want to make sure that they're looking at your data and they feel comfortable that your data has not been altered in any way and that it follows all the rules that are out there. So that was the gist of what I wanted to cover today. We're about 40 minutes into what we did. I want to reiterate that we actually have a lot more detail on each of these topics. And we have a whole DCL learning series. The first thing was current and best practices for dealing with that. We have a whole section on just metadata and taxonomies and what they're all about. How do we improve time to market with looking at content structure and integrating multiple systems together? Cloud compliance and regulatory all together. The content from multiple clinical sources when you get up into doing your clinical trials and you're doing more there. How do you tie those together? And then the types of tools that we use and what's important for us out there. And then map or scrap, depending on how old you are as a company, you may have legacy systems that you need to either do something with, migrate, or get rid of. So that's what this whole series was about. I encourage you, if there's a topic that's of interest to you or something that is, that you need it, but you don't know what it's all about, please take some time and go and take a look at some of these. And these, again, are hanging off the Court Square website. More than happy to talk to you about any of that stuff. And right now, from a perspective of next steps, Ian is in the audience that's out there. We'll make these slides available to you guys. And, we've got both RegDocs and Court Square. RegDocs is our content repository that we use. Court Square Group is the company that we host the Audit Ready Compliant Cloud. And we can host any application for anybody in that cloud environment. So all the way from preclinical through manufacturing.